Hi there, this is David Pepose, writer of Punisher, Savage Avengers, The Devil That Wears My Face, and Space Ghost, and you are listening to the Oblivion Bar Podcast.
Welcome to the Oblivion Bar Podcast with your host, Chris Hacker and Aaron Knowles.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 159 of the Oblivion Bar Podcast. I'm your vengeful stun chuck wielding vigilante, Chris Hacker. And joining me this week is everyone's favorite intergalactic late night talk show host, my co-host and BFF, Aaron Knowles.
Hello, and welcome to my show.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Oblivion Bar Podcast. This week on the show, we are talking to the writer of Space Ghost over at Dynamite Comics. You may also know him as the writer of The Punisher and Moon Knight and a bunch of other great comics. David Pepose is joining us here on the show to talk about all the things I just listed here. And
David,
for one of the first times in Oblivion Bar history, I'm not present for this conversation. Aaron, you took on this interview alone.
This is my plan, the eventual downfall of Chris Hacker.
The usurping of Aaron Knowles here on the Oblivion Bar Podcast. You got a couple more interviews to go, though. I will say I have a couple in the bag. I'd say just solo,
a few,
just a little bit. But I was actually present for this conversation, and it was a great one. Aaron, you did an incredible job. I'll say just off the top, my overall impression of Dave is he's incredible, like an incredible guest, right?
Yeah, I think that he knows. As somebody with, obviously we talk about it on the show, but he has a journalistic background, and as somebody who comes from a journalistic background, he knows what the people want to hear, and therefore he was so good with answering questions that he knew the evolution of where the conversation was going, and it was just so easy to talk to him. Not just because I think he and I'm gonna toot toot my own little horn I got over here. But he and I feel like we have a good rapport. We've met in the past, and maybe this is what you feel like with just about every guest that we have on the show. But like David and I have like a special rapport, and so it was kind of a cool opportunity just to have like this conversation with him. And I really love the fact that he's just a dude, he's kind of.
We love a dude here on the Oblivion Bar, right?
Good dude.
We love a guy, the guy's guy.
With David, he's like a guy who knew what he wanted to do, and again, we say it during the conversation, but he kind of does like everything else in the world around it.
Yeah,
and he's just
he was circling it, right? Like a lot of folks do.
He just kind of fucking fell into exactly what he wanted to do, and and it's fucking killing it.
Yeah.
Killing it.
Yeah, I think falling into maybe implies that he lucked, but not at all, right?
No.
That's not what you mean at all. But I think it's important to distinct that he worked his way up from Spencer and Locke up to Marvel, and now where he is now, which we say, I think we may have said this on the grid at one point. We're going to look back here in 2028, 2029 and go, wow, those two Eisners for David really make sense, right? Like he had sort of this very sort of like a meteoric surge in the comic medium. He was writing Spencer and Locke in 2017, and now he's writing Punisher and Moon Knight. He did something with the Hulk, and he's obviously doing other creator-owned work as well. Like I didn't get to talk to him, of course, in this conversation, but I would have loved to, and I would love to at some point pick his brain on The Devil That Wears My Face.
Yeah,
Aaron, I've had this weird interest / fixation on Catholic horror recently.
You have?
I watch it.
It makes sense.
Immaculate. I watched the new the Good Omen, or the First Omen, the new movie. Yeah. And then of course The Devil That Wears My Face, which is sort of plays in that sandbox.
Yeah. And we're not even talking like Space Ghost, because again, he is over there doing, again, he has taken these properties and he is just nailing it. It just, when you talk to him, it seems, I'm not trying to blow him up too much or give him too much. He just feels like he's just not even it's not even a hard thing for him to do. He's just creating it, having a good time with it, loving it, appreciating it, being passionate behind it, and it's working.
Yeah, 100%. It's what 110%. Happens when you get
It's
what happens when you get someone who loves comics.
Yeah.
They finally get their shot to write the comics. Like, I think very specifically of, We had a guest on not too long ago, a bonus interview that we had, Zach Quaintance, who is writing who had a Kickstarter book that came out. And I feel like at some point we're going to say the same thing about Zach as well. There's just these creators, there's these folks who just get comics, who love comics, who understand the medium in a very specific way. And when they finally get their shot, they knock it out of the park. And David is absolutely that now, and will continue to be that, I'm assuming. So enough preamble. Let's go ahead and we'll eventually get into this conversation. Aaron, will you quickly tell the folks back home how they can support the Oblivion Bar podcast?
I believe that you're referring to the Patreon.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes.
So the Patreon.
Welcome to our Patreon.
Welcome to the Patreon. So we have a Patreon, if you didn't know, after this many episodes, but patreon.com/Oblivion Bar Pod. It is the best way to support the show. You get access. For supporting the show, you get access to so many things. You get access to The Grid, which is our weekly exclusive, episode for the Patreon members themselves. Okay. You get early access to transcripts. The normal episodes you get early access to as well. So you get to hear those before anybody else does. You get a special shout out at the end of every single episode that comes from me. I put my heart in that. It's
not pre-recorded, and you can tell.
It's not. All right. I like to do it every single time to show you guys.
Let's do it live.
Let's do it live every single time. How much I appreciate you guys. How much we appreciate you. Okay.
Yeah.
And you can join.
We'll be sending out some goodies.
Yep.
We have some packages coming out here soon to all our patron members, comics and stickers and such.
If you like a 4-letter word that starts with F and ends with REE, we got you. We send out free stuff all the time.
Yeah.
You like that?
Yeah, that was good.
We're
not going to dive into it. I'm going to let the listener figure it out.
Patreon.com/Oblivion Bar Pod. Again, it's the best way to support the show because everything that we earn goes right back into the show. But the other ways, and I'm going to say this, the other ways that you can support the show, share the episodes, tell your mom, tell your friends, tell your buddies. Tell your dog, hire a guy who flies a plane and do some skywriting about how amazing the Oblivion Bar Pod is, and just tell a friend, word of mouth. Help people hear the amazingness that is our constant bullshit.
5-star ratings as well. Only 5 stars. Don't do 4. Come on. Don't be accurate with your judging. Just give us the 5 stars.
Yeah.
If you put the effort in, either do 5 or 0. One of those two things. We would prefer 5. Yeah.
Do 5 and then talk shit in the comments.
Thank you. Exactly. Do the 5-star and then leave a comment and say, "Wow, this show is shit." But David was cool. But Aaron and Chris, what's going on with them?
What a bunch of dinguses.
What a bunch of bungholes over there over in the Oblivion Bar.
Couple of bungholes.
Alrighty, that'll be enough of our Patreon talk. Let's go ahead and get into this conversation with David Pepose.
Hey everybody, our sponsor for today's episode is G Fuel, the official energy drink of esports. Whether you're a casual gamer, a content creator, an everyday Joe, or an esports pro, G Fuel's sugar-free, antioxidant, and vitamin-fortified focus-enhancing and high-performance energy products will give you the edge you need to fuel your grind. No sugar, no gluten, no crash, just natural, clean vitamin energy that's available in over 40 lip-smacking flavors. While stocking up at gfuel.com, use our code OBP at checkout for 10% off your entire order. That's OBP at checkout. G Fuel, performance energized.
And now, this week's special guest.
Joining us this week on the show is the former crime reporter turned Ringo Award-winning comic book writer behind titles like Punisher, The Bullet That Follows, Moon Knight, City of the Dead, Savage Avengers, The Devil That Wears My Face, and many, many more. Recently, he has reinvented the classic Hanna-Barbera intergalactic crime fighter, Space Ghost, over at Dynamite Comics with artist Jonathan Lau. It is my honor and distinct pleasure to welcome David Pepose onto the Oblivion Bar podcast.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me on the show. What an intro. Thank you so much for all that. I'm super stoked to talk all things comics with you. Yeah, man, thanks for having me.
Oh, it is absolutely a pleasure. We met, I think it was last year at San Diego Comic-Con. Yeah. And I just feel like, we had like kind of a kindred spirit going, right off the bat, not just because I was wearing your badge, which was fun in itself, but just, to learn about you, to see what you've done. And again, this is something you might have heard before, and I'll say it multiple times. I am the junior comic reader when it comes to the Oblivion Bar podcast. And so to learn what goes into the books that I do enjoy reading and the characters, and then to actually afterwards meet the artists behind them, or the writers, basically the creators.
Sure.
It is so awesome to, you know, put a name to a face and be like, you write my favorite characters.
Well, thank you. I mean, and honestly, it feels the same way from my side of the table. Just you know, you work on these books, and it's often in isolation. It's only when it's out in the world and readers are responding to it that the thing finally feels real. And that's really what kind of gets me out of bed every day is, you know, I'm not doing this for the fame or the money or the prestige. I'm doing it just because, like, I'm a true believer. I love comics. I'm a third generation fan. I've been reading these since I was 5 years old. And to be able to connect with a whole community of readers who are, you know, willing to give my work a shot. And then the ones that do really respond to it and resonate with it, that's it's the best job in the world. So thanks so much for reading.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Chris and I are both advocates of obviously the comic book industry itself. And we're constantly telling, you know, if you're a fan, especially when we have a panel, like we had a panel just recently at C2E2, and we made sure to tell people who are at the panel, like, if you enjoy a comic, if you enjoy a story, if you enjoy whether it's, you know, a big you know, unique IP, a self-published book, tweet about it. You know, post about it, like, let the artists know, let the creators know that you love it. But yeah, let's get into our first question, which kind of still has to do with what we're talking about right now, obviously. But welcome society. It's incredible to have you here. And I'm not sure if people know this or not. I know, you know, quite a few people, excuse me. I'm not sure if a lot of people know this or not, but you actually started out and you still dabble in journalism and the circuit around it.
It's funny. I sort of had my own Clark Kent Superman kind of persona for a little while, in that when I graduated college, I had just finished up at an internship at DC Comics, but it was also during the Great Recession. So there were no jobs in the industry to be had. And so I wound up falling back on journalism. I worked as a crime reporter and a state politics reporter in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the Berkshire Eagle. And I did the afternoon, evening, night shift. And then in the mornings, I would moonlight at Newsrama, where I served for a decade as a journalist, an interviewer, a reviewer. And yeah, you know, it was a really great experience. You know, just it taught me not to be afraid of a deadline or a blank page, and really kind of teaching me to think on my feet as far as, like, where am I finding my stories, and making sure that, like, I deliver deadline. And particularly, you know, being at Newsarama, I learned so much about, like, what I liked about comics and what I didn't, and really forced me to articulate my tastes and kind of develop my own toolbox based on what I was seeing all these other creators doing. And I was also lucky enough to interview a lot of creators, and I did a process interview series for about a year and a half, where I interviewed creators like Scott Snyder and Rick Remender and Greg Pak and Nick Spencer and and Marjorie Liu, just to name a few. And I learned so much about that, about the process of writing, and that it really is, it's a craft. It's something that I think anybody can pick up. You just have to kind of really be focused and dedicated to doing it and trying it and getting your reps in and failing and then learning from your failures. So yeah, those were some really, it was the best kind of boot camp I could have possibly asked for. And while I'm now doing comics full time, yeah, you know, it's sort of that scene, you know, where Batman says, I don't call myself Bruce Wayne in my head.
Yes.
That is, you know, I think in my head, I still identify a lot as a journalist, even though I haven't been a journalist in about 5 years. But yeah, you know, I feel like that's sort of my background. And I think that kind of zigzag background, well, it didn't make a ton of sense while I was doing it. It really, I wouldn't have had a career without it.
It's an interesting origin story. And the reason I like it so much is because I can absolutely relate to it, as that's what I do, is I do public affairs and I do journalism. So I've spent the last 12 years writing news and doing all that, and, you know, everything that kind of encompasses with, like, interviews and print journalism and photography. So it's interesting to try and put myself in your shoes and then, like, transition it into comics, which obviously I am I don't write comics. I dabble in a little bit of creative writing, but
Sure.
I cannot fully imagine that transition. So it's so interesting. But I wanted to ask, how does that, because obviously, like you said, the deadlines,
Yeah.
the thinking on your feet, getting your story together. How does that experience really factor into the actual like comic writing aspect of creating the story and the process that goes with it, and
Yeah.
in your now blooming career?
Well, for me, the secret that I've always had for comics writing is it's how do you break it down into its most simplistic parts? If you try to just immediately go into, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, and I'm immediately going to go into a script. Uh, that's something that might work if you're doing a short script, but if you're trying to do any sort of long form thing, I couldn't do that. That's not how I operate, and so. Writing for journalism, I think, was very helpful in that I tend to write kind of modularly. So, when you're writing a news article, you have usually a certain amount of space, whether it's an inch count or a word count. And, you have, certain quotes that you need to fill in there, and you need to sort of lay out your information in a certain way. And sometimes you might say, oh, okay, well, this is how much I have for print, and I can add on more for the website. So you learn to triage pretty quickly. Here's
Mhm.
what's the most important thing. And sometimes you'll write it out and you'll be like, you know what? This information's coming out too late. I got to lop off the transitions at the beginning and end, and then I can kind of shift that graph higher. I do that with seeds.
Okay.
Um, but even then, the way that I break down scripts, I tend to write kind of the vomit outline, where it's literally I'm not worried about page counts, I'm not worried about panels, I'm not worried about what's the cool little bit of dialogue. It's just what's the story here. And then I break that down. I tend to break that down issue to issue, and then I break that down page to page. And I say, okay, I know I've got 20 pages in this issue, or I've got 22 pages in this issue, and getting a sense of like, okay, how much ground do I have to cover? So I'll trim stuff based on that, and then once the page to page breakdown is done, then I go panel to panel, and I literally break down every page. I know that unless I'm doing a splash page, I tend to have 3 to 5 panels to choose
Mhm.
from, sometimes 6 once in a blue moon, or if I wanna bust out that 9-panel grid, but I know that, okay, like, this is sort of the rhythm that I'm playing within, and once all that's done, then I can kinda dig into the dialogue. Say, okay, like I know that these are sorts of themes that I want to establish, or here's exposition that I need to get out, or here's just like a little character beat that I want to kind of establish through dialogue. And every once in a while, it's just, oh, here's a one-liner, here's a fun joke, and once
I
you've
have the
done
perfect
that, you're like,
example of
oh,
that.
I've just made a comic. But it's breaking it down into its component parts, and I think writing for journalism was like a very important way for me to learn how to do that.
Were you taught like as far as for setting up the story and making sure like the important stuff is at the top and the least the inverted pyramid? Were you taught like using the
Yeah,
inverted pyramid?
I
Okay.
was definitely taught the inverted pyramid. Yes, I mean, it's one of those things that my late aunt, she was a journalist. She was a copy editor at the Washington Post, and I spent a summer in the Beltway, living in her basement, where I was interning, and yeah, journalism was such a fun job. It was definitely a young man's game for
Hmm.
me. I think very quickly I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm built to do this forever. And I think that's kind of what led me to comics is ultimately I was trying all the stable jobs, and I don't think I was great at any of them. I went from being, a newspaper reporter where like I was able to keep my head above water, but it was a very challenging job.
Hmm.
Particularly it's a local newspaper, and so there people the personnel was getting crunched pretty significantly when I was over there. I wound up going back to school. I went to Columbia to study publishing because I thought maybe I would get into the comics industry if I had studied, publishing. I thought back then I wanted to be an editor. I wound up tripping and falling into a publicity and PR job at CBS in New York, and I spent 5 years there, and that was a very stressful job, and one that I don't think I was necessarily positioned to really stand out. I was sort of the perpetual low man on the totem pole. Um, and then I wound up moving to Los Angeles. Everyone said, "Oh, well, if you want to work in development or current programming, you should move out to Los Angeles and you can be a Hollywood assistant." And Um, at that time, I'd written my first book. I'd written Spencer and Locke, and I had said, well, I can prove that I can work in a story office by saying I can break down story. And I can tell you, my Hollywood assistant job was the hardest job of my entire life. I
Yeah.
was working part time. I was driving an hour and a half commute each way, and it was a tough, punishing job. And suddenly, my first book came out, and we were getting like really positive, strong reviews for Spencer and Locke. And it occurred to me at that moment that I'd been putting the cart seriously before the horse. That if people would like the writing that I did, maybe I could just do that for my
Hmm.
job. And so, yeah, I some of it's a little bit of a leap of faith, but it was also just I tried everything else, and this was the job that I felt like I could actually be good at. And so, yeah, I consider every day that I work in this business a real privilege. And yeah, that's what really kind of inspires me to get up every day and try to deliver my A game.
Man, it's one hell of a journey, because it sounds like you were just like circling the exact thing that you wanted to do, just like moving all the way around it, but never exactly landing on it. And that must have been frustrating.
Well, I grew up in the Midwest. I didn't really have like creative role models, so to speak. And so I kept
Mm.
thinking like, oh, it's got to be an office job. It's got to be an office job. And it wasn't until, I kind of tripped and fell into this field where I kind of pushed my first book through that I was like, oh, there's like people do this. There's a whole industry of people that do this. And yeah, it wound up being very freeing. Now I kind of can't imagine life doing anything else.
Yeah.
It really does feel like I got my astronaut job. So yeah, yes, it's very much a pinch me kind of thing. I'm always sort of like feeling like the simulation is somehow glitched when I see the books that I've been lucky enough to work on. But yeah, it's a dream job. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Well, speaking of tripping and falling into almost a predestined kind of position, let's talk about The Punisher.
Sure.
Because, that also deals with crime and, obviously talking about what, criminals that the Punisher dealt with. But your 4-issue run on Punisher with artist Dave Wachter, I'm going to approach this question delicately, and I'm going to let you kind of take
Sure.
it how you want to answer it, and you'll understand when I get there. But Chris and I are constantly discussing the misusage of the Punisher's logo, and it's funny I say that
Sure.
because I'm wearing it right now. The fact that it's so many extremist groups and all types have just basically bastardized this symbol and misappropriated its meaning, and you even have the creators, creators behind Punisher speaking out against the misuse of it. But we're just curious about, did you consider any of that, after being asked to headline a new Punisher title?
Oh,
And
yes.
to what point in the process did you decide that you wanted to introduce? Well, let's go with that. Did you consider the
Sure.
logo?
Yeah. Well, I think the question might be a little cart before the horse in that when I came into this project, when my editor Tom Brevoort first approached me, um, I had written Punisher 2099 in the pages of Savage Avengers, and I know when that was sort of a late breaking kind of change because, as anyone knows, from my run on Savage Avengers, uh, I was about 2 issues in writing that series when word came on from up high that Conan Properties had new management and that what we had kind of all figured was going to be just an extension of the deal was no longer going to be a thing. And
Hmm.
so, thankfully, I had pitched that series with an escape hatch for Conan. Our first arc was in the Hyperborean Age, and saying like, okay, uh, I had said, we could write him out, even knowing before I knew that we weren't going to have Conan after
Very
issue.
smoothly done, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was told I think I had to write him out by issue 8, and I was like, well, based on the way that we're doing the arcs, I'll write him. So the only real pivot that we had for that series was, okay, what are we going to do for arc 2? We knew we were going to go to a dystopian future, but without Conan, I was very insistent that we need a new headliner for this series. And I had asked to use Frank Castle in my initial roster, and that's how I found out that he was going to be working with the Hand in Jason Aaron's run. So my thought was I wanted to have a Punisher in there. We talked about Rachel Cole Alvis for a little while. We just couldn't make the numbers fit. for that many characters. But I said, okay, let's put in Jake Gallows, Punisher at 20. And I remember that there was a little bit of discussion of just like, hey, like, there's a little bit of heat going on as far as that, as all things Punisher related, and like, just be careful with what you're doing. And the way that I wrote that character, Tom really liked how I approached it. That we really kind of sidestepped a lot of the political landmines that are associated with the Punisher, right? So he approached me. It was last February. And he said, listen, we are doing a new Punisher series after Jason Aaron's run wraps up. And here's the twist. We're going to be introducing a brand new legacy character. And we really liked what you did on Punisher 2099. Would you have any interest? And, it's one of those things. I tend to have a pitch in my back pocket for just about everything, but like Legacy Punisher is not on the bingo card.
Right.
And, but it was one of those things that like, I love working with Tom Brevoort. I consider him a real hero. And so, if Tom's asking, like, of course I would run with that, because I know that this is a guy who, despite all the plates that he is spinning, he gives amazing notes. He really laser focuses on everything to make sure that like a story's not going out that feels half baked. And in particular, the very first conversation that he and I, or one of the first that we ever had, was him saying like, I remember you were a reviewer and I remember you weren't always easy to please. So for you, good enough's not going to be good enough.
It's a good reputation.
And I took that as a huge compliment, because that's exactly how I feel. Like, I want to make sure that I'm pushing everything I'm doing to be as good as I could possibly make it. So, so they came to me and said, listen, we want to do a brand new Punisher. And, we're going to do it across 4 issues. And we thought you'd be the right guy for the job. And so we went back and forth quite a while, just to kind of get a sense of how do we tell a Punisher book that still feels like a Punisher book, but is still different, kind of has its own thing. But also, how do we tell a new Punisher story that sidesteps all of the political landmines that have become associated with the character right now? Things like, law enforcement and military adopting the logo. Whereas, like, that is a symbol of extrajudicial vigilantism. Things like, how do we kind of extricate the Punisher, knowing that he's a character that relies on guns and weaponry? How do we kind of extricate it from like fetishizing guns? That somebody could walk into a Walmart and walk out thinking that they're the Punisher. I see him like Rorschach as kind of a character who he's fun to watch, but he's definitely the ultimate do not try this at home character.
Yes.
And I do think that I think there has been some degree of drift for the Punisher in recent years. I think, and I say this with all the love in the world, because Garth Ennis, like, he changed the game. He changed the game when it comes to Punisher stories. But I think as a result, there was, I know that there were a lot of people who were like, well, what about like how gory is he going to take out somebody? Where's the blood? And for me, that's not necessarily something I'm super interested in. For me, the way that we kind of approached it was, how do we have a character that still feels kind of as simple as Frank Castle was? And so we approached it as, the John Wick of S.H.I.E.L.D. That this is a guy who had retired before the events of Secret Empire, so he's not caught up in any of that. Just to pursue the call of family. And what happens when his past comes back to roost? And suddenly his house has been blown up. His family is still inside, and the police all think he did.
I think you did it so perfectly. And I just got to say, because you like, you're talking about, like, earlier you're talking about your exposition, the characters, and the inner monologue. And I love, so one thing I love about the Punisher, and that was actually one of the first things that I noticed when I was reading through these 4 issues, was you swing for the fence in the story, but you do it so controlled and appropriately that it just fits. And I was gonna say that because I can even tell that you were almost careful with your approach to, because he's not Frank Castle. Joe Garrison is his own person. He had his own job at S.H.I.E.L.D. He was the gravedigger. So it makes so much sense, especially when you compare him to John Wick.
Yeah.
Being that he was S.H.I.E.L.D., he was a company man. He did his job efficiently, and it wasn't overzealous. It wasn't over gory, and it just fits this. Like, if you're shoehorning like, again, a whole new character who's being kind of forced into this role, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
He is still Joe Garrison, but he's now just got to kind of accept this role. And I love, and that's the one thing is I love this, and I have it, on my iPad right now. It's the scene where he finally accepts. He's like, because I'm not pretending anymore, but he's still doing it in his own way.
Yeah.
And it's really well done.
Thank you. Well, the big thing that we discussed a lot was calling yourself the Punisher, whether it's in Marvel 616 universe or in the real world. That is a choice. I think anybody can know, both in the real world and in the Marvel Comics universe, the iconography of the Punisher is very controversial. And so that was something that I really wanted to lean into, is that, like, calling yourself the Punisher is a choice, and it's not something that you do overnight. When you first meet Frank Castle in Amazing Spider-Man 129, I think, he's already Punisher. He's already kind of fully formed. He's clearly stacked up a body count already. He's made this decision to be this person. For me, I thought it was nice to kind of have a character that hasn't been marinating in that loss, that is sort of still coming to terms with it. And the idea that, like, the Punisher name is sort of thrust upon him by circumstance, less than any sort of deliberate choice. And then he has to kind of grapple with that choice as the series goes on. I thought that was kind of our way of kind of, like, threading the needle a little bit, in that we're not trying to legitimize any bad actors that are out there, but at the same time, we're not embarrassed to tell a Punisher story. That, if anything, this is sort of adding to the mythos in the same way. And again, I say this as somebody who loves Frank Castle, but to say that Frank Castle is the one and only Punisher, I think, is perhaps ignorant of comics history, where you have characters like Lynn Michaels, you have characters like Rachel Cole Alvis, you have characters like Jake Gallows, you have Outlaw. The Punisher has had his own legacy, so adding one more to the mix, I don't think is as blasphemous as some people might say. But yeah, also we wanted to kind of carve a unique niche out for Joe. I looked a lot at Robbie Reyes as Ghost Rider, where you've got Johnny Blaze and Danny Ketch, the motorcycle Ghost Riders, and then you have Robbie, who's the muscle car Ghost Rider, and it fits the theme of the character, but it's his own unique. And so for me, I thought, what if we leaned into the gun fu John Wick choreography of it all? That this is the gun fu Punisher, that we have his own unique shield arsenal, which is elevated so we can take some interesting twists on everything. But ultimately, he doesn't need those. I talked a lot about Damian Scott on Batgirl when I talked with Dave Wachter about it, and Scott McDaniel on Nightwing, for that matter. The way that you can take a character, or our ACO on Midnighter was another big. It doesn't really matter what the arsenal is. You drop Joe in any setting, whether it's a restaurant or an aquarium or, an Atlantis or, an Avengers mansion or wherever you want him, and he's going to turn that setting into a weapon. Absolutely. And I thought that was kind of a fun, unique way to kind of set Joe apart. That whereas Frank is like a wrecking ball, this guy is sort of a surgeon, where you watch him kind of move his way through a crowd. And sort of take him out one by one. I thought Dave Wachter did such a fantastic job kind of realizing that in his artwork. I mean, I still think Punisher is one of the best looking books that I think he's ever done. And he really understood the assignment of how we were going to make Joe his own unique character that would do things in a different way than Frank Castle did before him.
You guys, again, yes, absolutely nailed that, because there's several, and this, for the listeners, there might be some spoilers. Obviously, we're covering some stuff, but there's these
books out, trades out.
There's these moments with Joe, and the funny thing about the Punisher, whether it's Frank Castle, Joe Garrison, or Jake Gallows, is you have the ones that have adopted the mantle, but you had Joe, who, again, like you were saying, kind of manifests this almost decision without making the decision, because it wasn't even, he was just getting his revenge, and then somebody was like, "Oh, the Punisher's after me," or people are saying, reports
Yeah.
of the Punisher being spotted.
Mhm.
It wasn't even him. He is a man on a mission, just like you said. He is a surgeon, and he's
Yeah.
out there trying to accomplish a mission, just like he was taught with working with the Shield. And
Yeah.
it's funny because that's exactly what society, real world society, has done with the Punisher. Is they've thrust on him their own ideology, their own vision of what he is,
Yeah.
and this person doesn't have this figure doesn't have a choice. He can't be like, no, 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 it's not me. He kind of just has to
No.
run with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're right, and I think that's a very kind of timely sort of story in a way that I don't think I recognized when I was writing it, but as it was coming out, because even when that book was announced, there were a lot of people who had a lot of preconceived notions about what they thought that book was going to be about, or what they thought Joe was going to be about, and sort of their very strongly held opinions, wherever you stand politically, of what a Punisher story should and should not be. And it was only sort of when the book came out that people started to kind of see the vision behind it. And they're like, oh, like this, it's an origin story. In the same way that Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck did for their 4-issue Punisher miniseries back in the day. So yeah, I feel like we stand in good company, and I'm so proud of how that book came together, and the response wound up being my best reviewed Marvel book to date. So yeah, I'm really happy about it, and to see that Joe, has more adventures coming. I know he's appearing in Erica Schultz's Daredevil: Woman Without Fear series that's coming out soon. So yeah, if you're a Joe Garrison fan, you should definitely pick that up. I'm very excited to kind of hand my baby off to another writer, because that's ultimately the way that Joe's gonna get traction. Is the more writers that kind of buy in and use him, the more of a permanent fixture he's going to be in the Marvel universe.
Absolutely. And I know I speak for, I'm sure, plenty of people when I say I'm excited to see where Joe goes from here.
Me too.
I just think I love the way that he was built into his story. I like the fact that he is, again, this old company man who's kind of being forced out of what he knows, but also forced into what he knows.
Yeah.
In a more freelance, if I may, pun intended, freelance style.
Yeah.
So I'm excited for that. And also, like, I have to say, I absolutely loved your scene where he talks about AAA, always called them the stun chucks.
Yes.
I audibly laughed. And that's the other one I have right here. Is I love the stun chuck scene.
Thank
and
you.
Again, you mixed such a serious kind of heavy moment of there's heavy moments in this book, and I just want to say this before we move on to the next question. There's heavy moments that you've written so well, and there's just like a minute amount of like levity that's put in there that just kind of makes it, that balances it out.
I wanted to kind of make it a point that every issue Joe had like a new and interesting weapon to deal with, and we had sort of the idea of building everything up to this this diplomatic retreat kind of came a little late in the game, that we were sort of putting all the pieces together. And a thing that Tom always tells me, and it's the reason why he is where he is the thing about superheroes that makes them heroic is not about them punching out a bad guy. It's about them protecting the little guy. And that's something that I've really tried to take with me. But I wasn't sure if that was something I should adopt in Punisher. And Tom was very encouraging of that he's like, like that's something we should be pushing for this character. And so the idea was to kind of make him a Punisher for the people. And so I said, okay, we've got these diplomats who have been gassed up literally with Fearmaster toxin, and they're tearing each other apart. It's interesting to have a Punisher who, like, normally, of course, the thing would be like, well, we shoot them dead. And he's like, I can't shoot these people dead. What do you do that you give them a weapon that still feels like appropriately badass, but is not going to kill these people? And so I don't know how I came up. I think I was just like, I was looking up just various types of weapons, because that's what the NSA is going to see on my search history. And I saw nunchucks, and then like something hit me where I was like, stun chucks. I was like, well, that's either the best idea or the worst idea, but I think I need to run with it. I remember I pitched that in my final outline to Tom, and I remember like having in brackets like, I could do something else if you think that's better, and he's like, no, stun chucks, keep the stun chucks. So seeing Joe and his stun chucks on the cover of Daredevil Woman Without Fear #2. Yes, I feel like if I add nothing else to the Marvel Universe, I introduce the concept of stun chucks. So
That
thank you for
is
that.
amazing. They're amazing. Well, speaking of fighting for the little guy and
Yeah,
being, a hero of the people, let's move on and talk a little bit about Space Ghost.
sure.
And you see the new series over at Dynamite with artist Jonathan Lau. I actually recently listened to. So we have a good friend of the show, Botter Milligan, over at the Short Box.
Yeah, great
And
guy.
yeah, awesome. He's a good friend, and we just did a panel with him also at C2E2, so we got to hang out with him. But you guys were talking about you being offered a 12-issue series and an
Yeah,
annual over the span of a year, which really feels significant in this day and age
yes,
when
it
it comes
does.
to comics, because mostly the norm is you're seeing the limited series, a couple, four, like a Punisher, 4 issues, or a maxi series. So when you were thinking about what you wanted to bring to Space Ghost, the
Yeah.
character and his return to the comics, of course, since Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's 2005 run, which, chef's kiss to Alex Ross for those covers.
Yeah.
Um, what was your North Star when it came to this character, to these characters?
That's a great question. Well, for me, Dynamite had approached me about doing the series, having seen what I was doing on Punisher and Moon Knight City of the Dead. I think I kind of hit a critical mass that they were like, yeah, like, we have this new line of Warner Brothers comics, and we would really love for you to take on Space Ghost. And I was aware of Space Ghost, obviously growing up in the Coast to Coast era, and having seen the maybe one-off rerun on Boomerang. It wasn't until my internship at DC that I learned who Alex Toth was. And I learned that he was like the Jack Kirby of Hanna-Barbera. And I learned that like Space Ghost was an actual like traditional superhero coming out on the heels of Adam West's Batman, because everybody wanted a piece of that superhero pie at that moment. So somewhere during that internship, I also got my hands on Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's Space Ghost trade. I don't know if they reprinted it or if an editor had a spare copy and gave it to me, but I remember reading it and being like, huh, there's like something to this guy. Like, I'm surprised there hasn't been more with him. Just knowing that he's got that Alex Toth design, and he's got that really iconic array of powers with the Inviso Belt and the power bands, and he's got the Phantom Cruiser, and he's got Ghost Planet, and he's got Jan and Jason Blip as these trio of sidekicks, and then he's got this amazingly stacked bench of villains that I think are really just as iconic as Spider-Man or Batman or the Flash. So I filed that away in the back of my head and thought, oh, that's a cool character. So you flash forward 15 years later, and suddenly Dynamite's knocking at my door. And so I was kind of like, yeah, like that is a character that's like kind of, what if Batman fought crime in the Star Wars universe? That could be really fun to do. I just wrapped up my responsibilities on Punisher. So I had time in my schedule. And so I rewatched all the episodes. I asked my editor, Joe Rayban, I was like, listen, I want to kind of just get reacquainted with everything. So I watched all the original 60s episodes, and I actually watched all the 80s revival episodes as well. And the thing that really stood out to me, sort of in contrast to Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's run, was how important Jan and Jason Blip were to that series. That it really was a true ensemble cast. Every episode has all of them in it. And I think back in the day, that was a very savvy choice, because you have Jace for all the little boys to watch, and you also have Jan, so girls don't feel left out of this show. And then of course you have a monkey, because back in the Silver Age, adding a monkey just like there was a noticeable uptick.
Yeah.
In popularity.
Speed Racer, all these shows
Yeah,
had, some kind of pet.
you see all the DC, like they would just be like, oh, the sales are down, let's add a monkey. Um, so you have all that, and I was just thinking like, oh, they're like way more important than I remember from this comic. And that was sort of the big light bulb moment for me for this series. Was I knew trying to do a standalone superhero origin in the way that Joe Kelly did, he would have beaten me to the punch by 20 years. There's no sense in trying to relitigate something. But nobody's ever really told a story kind of explaining Jan and Jace, and like, how did they wind up in Space Ghost's orbit? And
Yeah.
how did they wind up becoming like crime fighting sidekicks alongside of him? And I realized like, oh, that's a really interesting story that hasn't been told. And when you combine that with all the amazing ingredients that I've already discussed, particularly that deep stacked bench of villains, who really, Alex Toth's designs really breathed so much life into them, more than what the 5-minute episodes could ever really contain. I realized like, oh, I'd basically been invited into this like 5-star Michelin kitchen with all these prized ingredients, and then being told, oh, by the way, nobody's ever made a meal with this.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a
I
great
was
way
just
to
like,
look at it.
yeah, I was just like, oh, yes, of course. This is an amazing opportunity to tell such a fun story. And I think one that kind of returns to themes that I was really like exploring, things like found family and sort of, people kind of having their redemptive climb. I think that's something that always really speaks to me as a writer. And so, yeah, Space Ghost, kind of reimagining him as, yes, of course, this sort of Batman The Long Halloween meets J.J. Abrams's kind of sci-fi epic, sort of an ultimate style relaunch of Space Ghost and his continuity. But it's also the story of how Space Ghost kind of finds these two orphans and their pet monkey and brings them in, and how they become, his sidekicks and then become his trusted partners, and then this found family in their own right. And how do their kind of complementary tragedies kind of interlock, and how do these characters on an issue to issue basis get to grow and evolve and change and maybe heal. It really is, Space Ghost is sort of the ultimate single dad.
Yeah.
He's the Dr. Grant to Jan and Jace's Tim and Lev from Jurassic
I
Park.
honestly don't know if I'm ready for the rest of the next 11 issues of this, because I don't know, like I find it amazing. There's already this emotional attachment
Yeah,
that you've kind of facilitated, and not
that's great.
just
Thank
with
you.
Space Ghost, but with Jan and Jason Blip, because you've seen, again, much like the Punisher and him losing his family. Jan and Jason
Sure.
have lost their family, and then you actually get this introspective look on this pain. And the scene with the asteroid. I'm sorry, like spoilers, but the scene with the
No, please,
asteroids,
please.
and you can just feel the rage that, like, this is what Space Ghost is getting off of his chest. And so,
Yeah,
like, I'm so excited to see where this emotional journey goes, but also this badass action, journey goes, with Space Ghost and the found family. But yeah, it's already so built up and
thank you.
prepared for in the first issue. So I'm excited. Again, 11 more issues. But I do have to ask.
Yeah.
In your head, when you're writing Space Ghost, who do you hear? Gary Owens or George Lowe?
So, it's funny. I made it kind of a conscious choice to kind of separate, to try to give Space Ghost all these characters in my head. So it's a little like what do they call it? A Hieronymus machine. You don't know how it works. It just, as long as it works, it works.
Yeah.
So for me, it's always like, what's the voice that just like gets me across the finish line? So for me, I actually, the voice I hear in my head for Space Ghost is John Hamm.
Nice.
Where like it's this, it's a powerful voice, but it can kind of go from like a whisper to something that's like a little bit more thunderous, but also just the fact that it's that he can get these like withering one-liners. I think that's the sort of my way that I see Space Ghost, is that, he can be he can be a little grouchy. There's something inherently noble about the character, in that he knows that when Jan and Jace, there's nowhere else for them to go, his immediate instinct is, I'm going to take these kids in and I'm going to protect them. And it's only when he gets home, and almost immediately when he gets home, that he realizes like, oh my God, what have I done? Like, I'm in way over my head. Like, this is a side of it. It's forcing him to sort of exercise a level of humanity that he's been kind of pushing down ever since his planet was wiped out. Planet Vector, which has now been renamed the Ghost Planet. And so I like that kind of tension in that character, and that like at the level of complexity, in that he's trying to do the right thing, and he inevitably does step up, at least in a good enough sense. But he's a natural at fighting space pirates. But you ask him to take care of 2 kids and a monkey, and like, no amount of power bands are going to help you, man. Like, it's just, you got to step up. And it kind of, it does kind of cramp his style a bit. You know, he had a way of doing things, and now like, you know, when you add kids to the mix, it just blows everything up.
He doesn't have an Alfred to take care of them.
Yeah, well, you know, I think there's a degree of it that's a little autobiographical. The I didn't really recognize this until I was about 3 or 4 issues in, but my younger siblings are triplets. We have about a 9-year gap, so I count everything in threes. And so it was like 10 days shy of my 9th birthday when they were born, and I kind of felt like the dinosaur, like watching the meteor. My entire way of life just disintegrated, and it wound up, you know, I think being great, but like I very much relate to Space Ghost, and that like suddenly you've kind of got 3 kids just running around, and you can't really control them. I mean, you can tell them what to do, but you know, who knows if they're going to listen, and who knows kind of what mischief they might find themselves in that you couldn't have possibly thought of. That's the thing about kids, is you find out your heart's running around on the outside. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic for Space Ghost, in that like, yeah, he can punch out an asteroid, but like ultimately these kids are both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness.
Yeah.
And so watching them kind of play off each other, and watching Jan and Jace as sort of this funny pair, you know, Jan being kind of the feisty one who will tell off Space Ghost to his face. You know, she's the thoughtful one, but like that grates on her. And then Jace being like the impulsive gearhead who also like, he feels like he has to tell jokes, because if the morale isn't there, people aren't laughing, what little family he has left might go their separate ways. So there's like an inherent innate sweetness to that character. So watching them as like this yin and yang, and then Blip is sort of like this like comic relief, but also like sometimes like the MVP and certainly the MacGuffin of our whole series. And then Space Ghost is like the straight man who occasionally throws out like this withering one-liner, usually at the kid's expense. That's hilarious to me. You know, and I think going back to something we were talking about, you know, same way like in Punisher, I think there were, you know, people would have conceptions going into it. And I think for me, I see Space Ghost as representing its time. You know, it's a generational thing. Came out in the 60s. It's emblematic of Silver Age campiness, of the Adam West variety. You've got the 80s relaunch, revival, where it's coming right out, it's trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with Super Friends and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. You've got the Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti run, which I know it came out the summer before Batman Begins, but you would not know it.
Yeah.
It feels very much with that zeitgeist. So for me, I felt like that gave me permission to say, okay, it's 20 years later, we're, you know, year 2024. How do we reimagine Space Ghost through modern storytelling lenses? That said, there are plenty of people who all they know is Space Ghost from the 60s, or all they know is Coast to Coast. And so the idea of even a traditional superhero take, and granted, I've done dark books before, so I understand, like, people will be like, oh, are they doing like a dark and gritty reboot? And I don't tend to think that's what we're doing on this book. Anybody that would say that like what we're doing on Space Ghost is too dark, I would say, well, we do have an extended bit of Jace literally tugging on Space Ghost.
Yeah, it feels vintage. Yeah, but also modern. And I think that's what I picked up, is like it has this almost, like you said, like that campiness where it's like the old school. You feel that nostalgia when you're reading it, but and even kind of the way that they talk about some of the technology almost feels like it's from, you know, Hanna-Barbera having written it, or back in that day, you know, but at the same time, it does have like more of a modern, like not dark, but a little bit more of a serious tone with some of those. And I think that just happens to come with you developing that we didn't have that undertone. We didn't have that subplot of emotion and loss. And obviously you're going to have some, I'm not going to say dark drawing, but you're going to have some of those negative feelings that come with it that make it feel a little darker.
There's going to be some drama, like you said, like, you know, there's drama, but and there's suspense, of course, with the, you know, the superhero action. And there's going to be a couple issues where we do veer into a little bit of darker territory. I don't think it's spoiling too much because the solicits are already out, but like, you know, we've got our 2-parter with Zorak coming out. And the way that I had described Zorak when I pitched it to Warner Brothers, and the scripts are already done and written and mostly drawn, so they can't take it back now. You know, I said, like, calling him like the Space Ghost Joker, I think feels a little reductive. For me, this is a character who his very perspective feels alien. He's a homicidal praying mantis. And so for me, I said, like, I want to kind of think of him as more like the Charles Manson of space, where like he's got like his followers, and he's got kind of his own cult. And that's the reason why Space Ghost is so scared of this guy. This is a guy he cannot possibly predict, and suddenly he's got his own kids to worry about. How is that gonna kind of that clash gonna happen? And when Jan and Jace inevitably find themselves caught in the middle. So we're drawing from a variety of different influences and inspirations and genres, but I think ultimately the core of this series is we're never going to forget about these kids. We're never going to forget about Jan and Jace's relationship with Space Ghost, and I think that is a degree of hope that we're never changing. I think that is something that's always going to be sort of the bright, positive core of this series. That no matter what you do with the action, that's what this story is about. And so I think it's one of the most hopeful books I've ever written. I love writing it. I love writing these characters. And the fact that you feel so strongly about Jan and Jace and Blip and Space Ghost after 2 issues, that's what I'm hoping that all of our readers feel. Because I can tell you, issue 2 is one of my favorite single issues I've ever written, in part because we're able to kind of show not just the friction between these characters, although it's justifiable, but also like the wonder and the warmth and the humor that goes into all this. But ultimately, this is a story about like people with kind of complementary tragedies, and how do they, sort of pull themselves out of it together.
As a team, yeah. We actually had a comment come in from one of our Patreon members, Chris Jenks, and he wanted to say, he said he had no questions for you, but he just wanted to thank you for making Space Ghost relevant again. It makes him so happy. He said it brings him back to when he used to stay up late at night and watch Coast to Coast while playing Pokemon on his Game Boy Color.
Oh, those were the days. He'll have to say which version of Pokemon he was playing. I was Team Yellow growing up. But yeah,
I was Blue.
So you got to do it like a semester before I did. Yeah, it's one of those things. Like Space Ghost is a character who, when Dynamite approached me, I just felt like he was like vibrating with potential. Just like there's so much cool stuff. And he's a character who, like I said, those original episodes are about 5 minutes a pop. There's no backstory or continuity. There's very little even in the way of character development. There's just enough time to introduce a villain that exists mostly on vibes and Alex Toth's designs. Yeah. And then, their plot of the week or their plot of the day. And then, Space Ghost gets, thrown into it and he has to fight his way out. And even seeing, there hasn't been a ton of Space Ghost comics. There's been Joe Kelly and Ariel Alvetti. There's been Space Ghost kind of bookended Future Quest. And then he had a couple of adventures in Future Quest Presents, a little bit of Archie. There hasn't been much. I mean, I think I'm going to be like the senior most Space Ghost writer when this is all done, which is like a weird thing to think.
It's a good notch to have in the belt.
Yeah, and he's just a character that like, there's so much cool stuff to him. So I every time I get to write Space Ghost and Company, it's a gift, and I'm very excited for people to see what we have planned for this book.
Yeah, I'm just imagining you in that kitchen, in that metaphorical kitchen, just cooking, just a cooking. Mm-hmm. But I have one final question for you before we head out of here. But I just wanted, you started your career in comics with Spencer and Locke over at Action Lab in 2017, and have been on an absolute surge since. 7 years later, with your work both at Marvel and your creator-owned work, which, by the way, Chris wishes that he could be here like during the interview because he wanted to pick your brain. I'm sure he will at some point about The Devil That Wears My Face. Your rise in the medium has just been, again, so much fun to watch, even since I first met you, just a year ago. It's been awesome to see what you've been doing. But I wanted to ask, at this point in your career, and you can only pick one, but which of your titles so far do you think really highlights best what you do in comics?
Honestly, at this point, I'm going to say Space Ghost. I really think like I feel like every book that I do, I feel like I've learned something. from and so the next book I do always feels a little bit better, a little bit more polished than the thing I did before it. And so Space Ghost is kind of a book that I feel like I'm bringing every lesson that I've learned in comics to this series, and I think that's part of the reason why people have responded in as positive a way as they have. Um, I mean, but there are others. It's so hard to choose between your kids. I mean, of course, I love Spencer and Locke. I love it for kind of how scrappy that book was, and the OZ. I think that pound for pound, I think the creative team gelled so well. I'm very excited to do the third Kickstarter on that one, sooner versus later. Um, and The Devil That Wears My Face. I love the work that Alex Cormack did on that book, and that also strikes me as a highlight. So, and of course, Savage Avengers. I in the way that Spencer and Locke was kind of a scrappy debut, I feel the same way about Savage Avengers. But like,
Yeah.
boy, did I love writing every single page of that book. So yeah, I you can't go wrong picking up any of my books. I always say my puppy's kibble doesn't come cheap.
Yeah.
So anybody who
I'm
takes
I'm laughing because you're cheating. We literally said pick one, but go.
I'm just gonna give you my whole resume.
Yeah.
But knock on wood. I mean, I'm only about halfway through my tenure on Space Coast in terms of scripts right now. But I'm hoping that I feel as good by the end of this as I feel in the middle of this. And if I do, I think Space Ghost is going to be the work to beat in terms of my creative resume.
From my perspective, if you don't mind me saying, I would absolutely say Space Ghost for sure. I mean, I really enjoyed Savage Avengers, and I honestly have not read a lot of like big team ups like, like in the past, but I really enjoyed, and again, I was really surprised with your approach, and I'm a fan of your approach of kind of, again, these swings that you take, you just swing for the fences, but they almost feel so controlled that they just work so well. And it's like if I don't know if you're a baseball fan. I'm not really a baseball fan, but I do know that there's those guys who can look like they're about to hit the ball out of the park, but they actually just hit it light enough so it goes between the left and the midfielder, and gives them an entire chance to get that, like all those runners back to home. That's you. Like you're swinging for the fence, but you have it in a controlled way that these wins are just bringing in the entire storage for the win. And Space Ghost is absolutely one of them, because again, like even just within the first issue, you can feel that you've given a depth to Space Ghost that has not been there before, and there's not many writers that I feel can do that in almost like such a balanced way.
I mean, some of it is just it's being in the right place in the right time. I mean, there are characters that I felt that I've really gravitated towards, and I don't think if you had asked me a year ago, would you feel this strongly about Space Ghost? I'm not sure I would have said yes.
Same.
It was only sort of like, being in the right place in the right time and kind of getting to reacquaint myself with the character that I was like, oh, there's so much fun stuff to him. And I've found plenty of characters that I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have expected that I would have liked writing them. Carol Danvers, I had a lot of fun writing her in Avengers Unlimited. Same thing with Black Panther. Like I enjoyed writing them more than I liked writing Cap and Iron Man, which I would not have expected.
Careful.
And so it's always interesting to find the characters that you gravitate towards. And yeah, Space Ghost, when you have a book like that where you really feel like you're gravitating towards the character, it's work, but boy, it's the best. It's the best job I've ever had.
Yeah, I love, again, I love talking to you about these, because I like talking to creators, but I love especially when you have that passion for what what you're working on, what you're creating. Like you said, it always feels like it's the best work, that your current work is always your best work, because you're always putting into it, what you have learned so far, and making the new thing the best that it can be. But I feel like we've taken enough of your time. I want to thank you so much again, David. Thank you so much for your time today, letting me pick your brain, all things Punisher, all things Space Ghost. Again, the last thing I'll say is that, you're going to reinvigorate so many like fans to bring them back, or to introduce them to Space Ghost. So it's going to be really exciting to see what happens next with that character going in the future. I know I'm excited to read more of him and Joe Garrison and whatever else you have planned coming up in your future as a creator. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and for asking such great questions. And for everyone listening, thank you so much for taking your time to listen to me talk. And the big favor I can ask of anybody is if you call your local comic shop, you should be still able to pre-order Space Ghost issue 3 and issue 4. Space Ghost number 2 should be out by the time that this goes live. So yeah, pick up issues 1 and 2. Add Space Ghost to your pull list. I think we're doing some really fun stuff on this book, me and Jonathan Lau. And so, yeah, we'd love to have you along for the ride.
Awesome. Yeah. Make sure you guys go pick it up, put it on your pull list. Again, last time before we go, do you have anything else that you want to shout out, any socials, any projects, anything else that you want to kind of let the people know?
You'll be able to pick up the trade paperback collection for The Devil That Wears My Face on July 10th. So pick that up. That's right before San Diego Comic-Con, which I'll also be at. So if you're at San Diego, stop by. What else? The trade paperback for Punisher, The Bullet That Follows, is available everywhere comics are sold, so you can pick that up. Stay tuned. I've got a few more projects in the hopper for next year. Stay tuned on all of that. Very exciting things to come. And you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Pepose D. David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can visit my website, which is currently under construction, at davidpepose.com, or subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pepnews.
And I will personally vouch for David's Twitter. He is hilarious on his social media, so make sure you go follow him over there. And once again, thank you for being here, David. I appreciate your time. We're gonna get out of here, and thank you again. And hope once the trade comes out for Space Ghost, we definitely have to have you back on to talk all things.
Can't wait. Thank you so much for having me.
Alrighty, there's that conversation with David Pepose. Once again, thank you, David, for coming on to the Oblivion Bar podcast. I genuinely want David to come back on the show at some point. Like, he is an incredible guest. We said it at the beginning, but we're going to say it again here. He was very thoughtful with his answers. He was very gracious with his time. He told us before the conversation, we always like to preemptively tell the guests, like, hey, we're going to try to get you for about 30, 40 minutes, not take up too much of your time. But Dave was like, I'm here to hang out.
Yeah.
However long you want to talk, Aaron, let's do it.
I cannot wait to have him back and discuss this first story arc, like once it completes, of Space Ghost. I say it several times during the conversation, but I'm going to say it again. If you're not reading Space Ghost, you need to go pick up Space Ghost. You need to go to the Omnibus app and download it, or you need to go to your local comic shop and you need to pick it up. Or
both.
Or both. It's so good.
Yeah.
I just read the second issue. What he's doing with it is, I don't know. I feel like it's, again,
character defining.
It's character. Well, absolutely, because Space Ghost doesn't have this depth of character definition.
Sure. He's only had a couple series like in the history of comics.
Yeah. And the sarcasm that was Space Ghost Coast to Coast wasn't really his character. It wasn't the character design or development really of his villains, but we're getting that in this comic book, and it's so good. It's so good.
I'm glad that you took the conversation away from what I think a lot of I don't want to badmouth any other interviewers or shows, because they're all doing incredible work. But I think we decided very specifically that we did not want to compare David's run on Space Ghost to Coast, because that's very obviously not what he's trying to do. I think you can tell almost immediately, just based on Space Ghost's personality, plus Brock in this comic is like so not Brock from the TV show, right? So is it Brock or is it Bach or
Brack?
Brack. Thank you. Sorry. I don't know why I said Brock, but yeah, Brack is so not the Brack of the Cartoon Network Adult Swim era.
None of his rogues gallery is. And you don't, again, you almost had, I don't want to go into, I could honestly, like, I could talk about this.
Let's get David back on the show. David, come on back in.
I could talk about this for a while longer, but like exactly what you're saying. What you saw, and I'm so glad we didn't do that either. What you saw in Space Ghost Coast to Coast took those characters, took those villains, and made this almost what do you call it, like a Xerox copy that's just its own like element. Yeah. And was not a character. It was whoever was voicing it. Yes, it was the character. It was a version of the character for like a talk show, but it's not the characters in how they were ever developed. So like I love the fact that we're getting this introspective like redesign, this almost philosophical like reboot, remaster of everything that Space Ghost. And I feel honestly, I feel like I can say that the original creators, like these guys who are, behind the original series from the 60s and the 90s, would genuinely appreciate what David is doing to these characters. You know?
Yeah, very much. You said it there, but reboot, but also sort of a modernization of Space Ghost, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah, a modernization, but at the same time with that classic, like Hanna-Barbera, classic, like Joe Kelly, Ariel Olivetti, like feel to it. Like it still is in its essence like an old school like cartoon, but again, modernized elements, not dark like David was saying that some people are saying. It's not a dark storytelling. It is just this really defined look.
I think it does a really good job of sort of encompassing what Alex Toth did back in the day with the creation of the character. I think it just, and again, modernizing that to a modern audience, because we've changed, right? Like the way we view sort of this campy hero, it's fun in a nostalgic sense, but I think if you want it to work for modern audiences, I think some of the campiness can be left sort of in the simile part of the story, right? It doesn't need to be outwardly sort of boom pow golden age, right? And I think it's important really quickly to say, I don't know if people know this or not, but Alex Toth, obviously world famous legendary comic creator of the Hanna-Barbera era, but also he created Juggernaut. I don't know if you knew this, Aaron.
I did.
In X-Men, I think it was X-Men 12.
Juggernaut.
Yeah, so it's just interesting that obviously he's created a lot more characters than that, but I just thought it was a really interesting parallel. He wrote like one X-Men book and it was the creation of Juggernaut.
Nice.
So
what I was gonna say for what I like to think about with so there's this scene there's this like panel in the first issue where Jace, he's basically talking about Space Ghost like gauntlet in his belt. He's like, Invisibelt and Power Gauntlet sounds so much cooler. And like to me, when I read that, it reminds me, and I wish I would have told this to David when we had him, had him in here. Do you remember in Batman and Robin where they first land on Riddler's Island and he's like, "Holy rusted metal, Batman," and you have this throwback moment to like this old cheesy dialogue that is like just in this modern setting, and that's what that scene felt like to me. And it was done again, so many things that David does well, and it's you can't put him in a box.
And I think it's really quickly, we don't have to spend a ton of time on this, but I really love the conversation you guys had about the Punisher as well, how the bastardization of the character's symbolism, because these alt-right incels are not reading Punisher. No, like they've never read a Punisher book in their lives.
Yeah.
So the fact that they're putting it on their flak jackets and on the side of their cars with a blue line through it, they have absolutely no idea what the character stands for. And we're not sitting here saying that Frank's mission is this incredible, valiant mission, right? It's a vengeful, angry mission. But I think what I found really interesting was David's sort of response to that, and how like he was very aware of what was going on in modern times with the Punisher character, and sort of decided to take it in an opposite direction with Joe, right? So I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I like that conversation as well. And he will be back on the Oblivion Bar Pod. I'm excited about that. We'll talk all things Space Ghost another time, and
whatever else he's working on,
whatever else this man is nailing at that time,
whatever Eisner he's won at that time. Alrighty, well that'll do it for episode 159 of the Oblivion Bar Podcast. Aaron, next week we are going back into the anime realm. Speaking of Adult Swim, Cartoon Network era animation, we've got another installment, the second installment of our Midnight Rewind, which, this is a movie that I have only seen bits and pieces of, and it has a huge following. It's a legendary anime, Paprika. We were talking about the 2006 legendary movie. Aaron, what's your relationship to Paprika? I'm curious.
I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on this movie. It is a mind-bending, just like it is a trip for the senses. Great music, great visuals. The story is amazing. It's very almost, like whodunit, noir detective. It's psycho. It's a psycho thriller.
Okay.
In its best form, because it is a crazy batshit movie, and I love it, and I cannot wait to watch it again. I've honestly, like, this is one of those movies that pops up and I'm like, yeah, man, I should watch that again.
Well, now you have a reason to. And everyone listening to this right now, next week for episode 160, we will be covering Paprika. And again, this is not a review. We want to make a very specific point that the Midnight Rewind is not us harsh critiquing these movies. It's more of a celebration of why we love them, sort of giving some fun facts, discussing it together, what we picked up on these movies. So,
celebrate good movies. Come on.
Yeah. Exactly. So that'll do it for episode 159. Aaron, take us out of here.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, boy.
Subscribe to our podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcasts. That's where we are. Thank you to our patrons, Alex, Aaron. See, already messed up. Dang.
Yeah.
This is why we don't pre-record it.
Here's a problem though. You took your breath too early.
I did.
You say the first part, then you take your breath, then you go into this.
All right, coach. 110%.
110%. Get it.
Okay. Thank you to our patrons, Alex, Alice, Aaron, Botter from Shortbox, Brad Beat, Cassidy, Chris from the Bada Boom Pod, Chris, Jake, Christy, Danny, David, Elliot, George, Greg from First Issue Clubs, Haley, Ham6, Jake from Spectales, Jake S, Jeremy, Kenny, Kyle, Losi, Mac, Miles, Mike, Robert, Sean from I Used to Like This One, Travis, and Brad and Lisa from Comic Couples Counseling.
Nailed it.
Boom. Boom. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and Threads, @Oblivion Bar Pod. Thank you, Omnibus, for sponsoring the show. Use the link in our show notes to upgrade how you read comic books digitally. It's bitchin'. Official merch of the show can be found at our website, www.oblivionbarpodcast.com. Thank you, Kevin Ziegler, for all of our Oblivion Bar art. He's at the Zig Zone on Instagram. Thank you, Dream Kid, for all of our musical themes. Go check them out. They are killing it in the synth game right now.
Synthy.
Nice.
Ooh, Synthy.
Ooh, Synthy. Thank you, DJ Skybank, for our grid theme. That just threw me off. Thanks.
Sorry.
Thank you, Fancy Shop, for sponsoring the show. And last but not least, do not forget to tip your bartenders 20% or more. Do not forget to tip your servers, your people in the industry that take care of you. Okay, your delivery drivers, your DoorDash.
Not Qdoba though. Not Qdoba.
But don't be one of those goddamn DoorDash drivers that like will message you and say, "Hey, I'm stuck in traffic. I need $5 more. Can you give me $5 more?" Don't be that person.
You had that happen to you?
It hasn't happened to me, but I've been seeing it happen a lot.
No,
online. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
You don't do that.
Don't do that. Come on.
But tip your people.
That's right. Oh, and Aaron, we should have said at the top, Happy Pride Month.
Yeah, Happy Pride Month, man.
I think it's our first episode of Pride Month, so
it is. And I'm gonna do. You know what? I'm gonna do a Pride Month theme newsletter.
There you go. Love that. You've got like 20 days, so
yes,
you got a lot of time to think about it.
Yes.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Oblivion Bar podcast. We will see you next week for episode 160.